Jan Kochanowski, chief poet of the Polish Resistance, born 1530, died 1584, respectably long life, although I'm creeping up on that age right now, so I'm going to say that it's scandalously short. He was a courtier to the king, a noted humanist, classicist, and translator, prolific writer in Latin who also developed vernacular Polish as a poetic medium, giving it some credibility, giving it some legitimacy as a way of expressing art. Vernacular was on the rise. Vernacular is the speech of common people, and common people were suddenly getting, in the Renaissance, new legitimacy outside of the exclusive enclaves of Latin. The most famous work by Kochanowski is, well, this. It's called Treny, translated as Laments. It's an elegy comprised of 19 individual lyrics on the death of his 2-year-old daughter Ursula, published in 1580. These are individual poems, but they are set in a kind of sequence so that you can see an argument going along as it progresses, as he turns over in his mind, rational, turns over in his mind the meaning and consequences of this devastating twist of fate. He is, in his very deeply personal and painful way, trying to make sense of the universe, make sense of God, make sense of spirituality in general, and trying to understand what the Renaissance elements of traditional learning have to offer him, what the traditional learning of the Christian church has to offer him as he's dealing with this existential question in a deep, deep, very heartfelt position of loss. And the hints that he's throwing off as he goes along, I think, suggest more than what the specific words on the page, the literal meaning of the poem, might be. I think there's more going on here than might meet the eye. Look how it begins. Come, Heraclitus and Simonides, come with your weeping and sad elegies, ye griefs and sorrows, come with all the lands wherein ye sigh and wail and wring your hands. Gather ye here within my house today, and help me mourn my sweet, whom in her May ungodly death hath taken to his estate, leaving me on a sudden desolate. 'Tis so a serpent glides on some shy nest, and of the tiny nightingales possessed doth glut its throat, though frenzied with her fear the mother bird doth beat and twitter near, and strike the monster till it turns and gapes to swallow her, and she but just escapes. 'Tis vain to weep, my friends perchance will say. Dear God, is aught in life not vain then? Nay, seek to lie soft, yet thorns will prickly be. The life of man is naught but vanity. Ah, which were better then, to seek relief in tears or sternly strive to conquer grief? He is struggling with classical humanism here. He hints that in the very first line. Simonides and Heraclitus, classical figures. We're not going to go into them, but you can Google them. He is coming at this from the position of a classicist, somebody deeply invested in Greco-Roman heritage of his culture. And he's talking about specifically poets here. Come with your weeping and sad elegies. Elegies are poems. This is an elegy, a poem for a poem of loss, a poem of regret and pain. And calling on these artists of the classical era to come and offer him some solace, to give him a way of understanding this. And when he's going through this, he puts it in very personal terms immediately. Help me mourn my sweet, whom in her May ungodly death has taken to his estate. Now, a couple curious things there. Help me mourn. A father having lost his infant daughter, and he's asking for help. Can you imagine anything more sympathetic, anything more empathetic, anything more sad? Quite frankly, he's begging for assistance from a position of weakness, looking up at the world around him and trying to make sense of it. Whom in her May, meaning in the spring of her life, she was 2 years old. May is the time of rebirth and all of that. It is a poetic construction. So automatically, we're seeing he's grasping for what a poet has at his disposal, which is poetic frames of reference for making sense of the world. And by trying to deal with this on a poetic level, because that makes it easier, perhaps, to deal with. If you can think of it objectified as a problem of poetry, then maybe you can find some resolution for the deeply, agonizingly personal significance it has for you. And so he offers up this supposition of what his friends, fellow classicists and erudite gentlemen of education, no doubt, might say to him, "'Tis vain to weep." Oh, that's so silly. Why are you so upset? The classics tell us that we should be stoic, that we should not let the emotional attachments of this world disturb us unduly. We should maintain an equilibrium, an even keel that protects us from the turbulence of life. 'Tis vain to weep, as if that's a choice for a father losing a daughter. The life of man is naught but vanity. It is the kind of thing you would find on a Stoic fortune cookie. A neat little saying of that philosophy. Which were better than to seek relief in tears or sternly strive to conquer grief. That's the essential conundrum he's up against here. I can just cry endlessly for my loss, or I can do the stiff upper lip thing. Adopt an enlightened, intellectual understanding of the world, a rational understanding of fate, a detached, unemotional distance from human pain. And I can get through quite nicely like that. If I had ever thought to write in praise of little children and their simple ways, far rather had I fashioned cradle verse to rock to slumber, or the songs a nurse might croon above the baby on her breast, setting her charges short-lived woes at rest. Much more useful are the trifling tasks than that which sad misfortune this day asked, to weep over thy deaf grave, dear maiden mine. There's a lot going on there. Another reference to trying to think of this in poetic terms. If I were to craft this as children's verse, a happy little nursery rhyme perhaps, setting her charges short-lived woes at rest. That just seems cruelly diminishing of a child's death, short-lived. Oh, well, okay, that makes sense. And you can't help but notice that one line, to weep over thy deaf grave, dear maiden mine, your deaf grave. If a Christian, let's say, goes to the grave of a loved one, can they expect to be heard? Is it a point of communication? Is it a way that they can express themselves and hope that in the afterlife, perhaps the departed will get some communication? Or is this saying that afterlife, nah. And wall the harshness of grim Proserpine, classical reference, but now I have no choice of subject. Then I shunned a theme scarce fitting riper men, and now disaster drives me on by force to songs unheeded by the great concourse of mortals. Verses that I would not sing, the living to the dead I needs must bring, yet though I dry the marrow from my bones, weeping another's death my grief atones, no whit all forms of human doom arouse but transient thoughts of joy or gloom. O law unjust, O grimmest of all maids, inexorable princes of the shades. For Ursula, thou hadst but tasted time, and art departed long before thy prime. Thou hardly knewest that the sun was bright ere thou didst vanish in the halls of night. I would thou hadst not lived that single breath. What didst thou know but only birth, then death? And all the joy a loving child should bring her parents is become their bitterest sting. This is humanist, not stoic. It is about the attachment he feels, not the detachment that perhaps Taoism would advise. He can't not feel this. But he is still referencing, see all those little lines up there that talk about songs, about verses. He's still struggling to think of this in poetic terms, to wrestle it down into a problem of poetry and philosophy and all the stuff that the classics have shaped his understanding of. But that inherited tradition of classicism, of Stoic thought, is crashing head on into human actuality. So thou hast scorned me, my delight and heir. Thy father's halls then were not broad and fair enough for thee to dwell here longer, sweet. True, there was nothing in them meet for thy swift budding reason that foretold virtues the future years would yet unfold. Thy words, thy archness, every turn and bow, how sick at heart without them am I now. Nay, little comfort, never more shall I behold thee and thy darling drollery. What may I do but only follow on along the path where earlier thou hast gone, and at its end do you, with all thy charms, cast round thy father's neck thy tender arms. He's starting off by blaming the child, almost. Thou hast scorned me, as if it were the child's fault. He's lashing out. He's looking to blame someone, and she's right there. But that heartbreaking loss is causing irrational responses to this rational project of trying to make sense of the world. Leaping to stanza 6, dear little Slavic Sappho, she is a poet now herself. We had thought, hearing thy song so sweetly, deftly wrought, that thou shouldst have an heritage on day beyond thy father's lands, his lute to play, for not an hour of daylight's joyous round, but thou didst fill it with a lovely sound, just as the nightingale doth scatter pleasure upon the dark, in glad unstinting measure. Then death came stalking near thee, timid thing, and thou in sudden terror tookest wing. Ah, that delight, it was not over long, and I pay dear with sorrow for brief song. Thou still wert singing when thou camest to die, kissing thy mother, thus saidst goodbye. My mother, I shall serve thee now no more, nor sit about thy table's charming store. I must lay down my keys to go from here, to leave the mansion of my parents dear. This and what sorrow now will let me tell, no longer were my darling's last farewell. Ah, strong her mother's heart to feel the pain of those last words, and not to burst in twain. Here, she is a poet, an accomplished singer of poems at 2 years old. That's curious. And she gets a goodbye deathbed speech. My mother, I shall serve thee now no more, nor sit about thy table's charming store. Whose words are these? Do we believe a 2-year-old said these? No, seems unlikely. And that pose of composure. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine, Mom. Don't cry for me. I'm going to go on. I'll be fine. That sense of composure seems, let's face it, a little artificial. Unlikely in a child. But it's poetic. It is a deliberate heroizing of this child. It is alienating her just a little bit more. Putting her up on a pedestal like an angel. Which would mean that she is less human, which would mean that perhaps she is closer to God, but it's a way of distancing himself at this moment, this poetic speaker, distancing himself from this moment of the child dying by shifting her into a frame of poetic understanding. At this moment, she is not his child, she is simply a character in a poem. And maybe that's how he can deal with her. My dear delight, my Ursula, and where art thou departed? To what land, what sphere, high o'er the heavens wert thou born, to stand one little cherub midst the cherub band? Or dost thou laugh in paradise? Or now upon the islands of the blessed art thou? Or in his ferry o'er the gloomy water does Charon bear thee onward, little daughter? And having drunken of forgetfulness, art thou unwitting of my sore distress? Or, casting off thy human maiden veil, art thou enfeathered in some nightingale? Or grim purgatory must thou stay until some tiniest stain be washed away? Or hast returned again to where thou wert ere thou wast born, to bring me heavy hurt? Wherever thou art, ah, pity comfort me, and if not in thine own entirety, yet come before mine eyes a moment's grace, in some sweet dream that shadoweth thy grace. This is a hodgepodge of doctrine. Art thou departed to what land, what sphere? Ding, ding, ding. Motion of the spheres, Ptolemaic universe. One little cherub, a cherub, while having some Catholic connotations, is largely a inheritance from pagan belief systems. A little tiny angel of sorts, often a little mischievous. Or art thou in paradise? Are you in heaven? A Christian understanding of heaven. Or, again, back to paganism, pagan classicism. Does Charon, the boatman, lead you over the river Lethe to the underworld of the Greco-Roman heritage? You could say also that art thou enfeathered in some nightingale is reincarnation. not necessarily endemic to Poland of the 1500s, but perhaps he read something and he is lashing out for anything. And then he goes from there back to Catholic doctrine, purgatory, a strictly Catholic conception. Or hast thou returned to where thou wert ere thou wast born, to bring me heavy hurt? Have you gone to some divine realm where you have now returned? And in between, you came just to cause me agony. That suggestion of lashing out, but within this context of strictly poetic purpose. He's struggling back and forth with this for 18 relatively short poems. But then 19 is several times longer. It's like 150 lines of a dream where, after wrestling back and forth with all of these maddening options for how to deal with this, he lies down, he falls asleep, and he has a dream. And he imagines seeing the child with the poet's mother. Before mine eyes, in vision doubly clear, for in her arms she held my darling one, my Ursula, just as she used to run to me at dawn to say her morning prayer, in her white nightgown, with her curling hair framing her rosy face, her eyes about to laugh like flowers only halfway out. Art thou still sorrowing, my son? Thus spoke my mother. Sighing bitterly, I woke. There is a double heartbreak here, because in losing his daughter, it has caused him to reflect on perhaps the loss of his mother. And maybe the daughter was somebody who reminded him of his mother, and her little smile, perhaps, a little crooked smile maybe, or the color of her eyes. And that was something that he could say, well, okay, she looks like my mom at least. So in this vision, in this dream, he imagines the two of them united. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because he's divided from both of them, and now it has a double strength. But perhaps they are offering solace to one another. And then this long, long vision extends. Sighing bitterly, I woke, or seemed to wake, and heard her say once more. Seemed to. It's not definite. It is, in fact, indefinite. And the voice, the vision goes on. So here we have an instance of mysticism, spiritualism. It is not rational. But the voice of the mother gives more rationalist advice. Though dust returns to dust, the spirit given a life eternal must go back to heaven, and little Ursula hath not gone out forever like a torch. She lives on in the afterlife. And that is just the start of all of these lines, where he is wrestling again with this. If herefrom springs thy sorrow, that her years were broken off before all that endears a life on earth to mortals she might prove, yet think how empty the delights that move the minds of men, delights that must give place at last to sorrow, as in thine own case. Stoicism, Epicureanism, Christian suffering and redemption, all mixed up into one, and he is dwelling on this and dwelling on this and dwelling on this throughout, struggling with it to come to some resolution beyond the limits that his earlier poems have set for themselves, stretching that to try and find some answer, some reason, some solace. And maybe he does, or maybe he doesn't. So man, by taking thought, rationalism, at the very end, perceives them ere their accidents are wrought, and by such thinking banishes the past and views the future quiet and steadfast. That is Stoicism. Then bear man's portion like a man, my son. The Lord of grief and comfort is but one. That's a tough words from Mom, but is it good advice? Well, that's up to you. Is it reasonable advice when you're suffering like this? Buck up and go about your business? Well, I don't know. But those last two lines shifts everything even further into doubt. Then I awoke. And remember, he didn't know if he was sleeping or not to begin with. So everything is clouded in mystery here. Then I awoke and know not if to deem this truth itself or but a passing dream. Did it happen? Was it real? Is he doubting the reason of it? Is he doubting his own reason? His own reasonability, his humanistic inheritance? Or is he doubting faith? Is this a vision of his mom and daughter in the afterlife, under God's care, in God's hands? Or is that too all just a poetic device? Another version of the poetic device that he has been dallying with throughout, line after line after line, trying to make sense of the world in the only frame he understands, which is poetry. Trying to reconcile the classical inheritance that humanism has taught him with the tenets of faith that the church has raised him in. And finding that neither one is really sufficient. Neither one really closes the gap. They both leave him still suffering and uncertain at the end. Know not if to deem this truth itself. He doesn't know. He is left in that liminal space of mystery and uncertainty and paralyzing agony because he does not know. He doesn't know if he should understand the universe as a rational experiment in human creation, or all through the mystery of divine grace. He can't come to grips with that. And in the face of heartbreaking tragedy, like Job himself, he is left wondering. But he is not, unlike Job, he is not answered by God. He is not offered that. So in effect, this poem, as he writes out especially that last 19, or that last verse 19, that last stanza, he is challenging God like Job, saying, this is what I'm going through. This is what I'm struggling with. This is the pain and agony that you have subjected me to. And the implicit purpose of that is always, what do you have to say for yourself, God? Why did you do this to me? But at the end, he gets nothing. No answer, no response, no stability, no reason to make him feel better for the fact that his child died. This is a remarkable document of the struggle of humanism and Christianity in the Renaissance.